Shavua Tov. I have a confession to make as I open. I am recycling two shiurim or speeches that I gave. One was about 25 years ago, and one was about 15 years ago. And the reason I'm recycling them is because as I went through my notes, I see that what we said 25 years ago and what we said 15 years ago is exactly appropriate for tonight. Both of these were in Parshat Vayigash, and Vayigash opens with this emotional confrontation between Yehuda and Yosef, a confrontation that's been playing out since Parshat Vayeshev, and Chazal and the Balei Machshava, based on Midrashim, view it as a fundamental conflict that existed within the children of Yaakov, two different approaches to Avodas Hashem. The sons of Leah, the sons of Yosef, were supposed to remain within the confines of the Beit Midrash and mitzvot. We're supposed to go out and change the world. We're supposed to influence the world. And these were fundamental conflicts that existed. The confrontation between Yehuda and Yosef this week, so the Midrashim say, Chazal say, Vayigash, Yehuda, so it says, Echad be'echad yigashu, Ze Yehuda and Yosef. And it represents really conflict that seems to be endemic to the Jewish people. I think that, well, as I said, I spoke 25 years ago and 15 years ago. The conflict, the machlokas, the divisiveness in Klal Yisrael today is much worse. And I think we could say with humility that the people sitting in this audience, our Talmidim, our alumni, somehow or other are charged and able to overcome that and understand drachei darchei noam, that there are legitimate Torah paths and that yours doesn't have to be the only way. Yaakov Avinu is called a bayit, Beit Yaakov. And I believe there's a difference between a bayit and a community. A community is, you'll think carefully because it sounds like, yes, Darchei Noam is a community. Well, if you'd really think carefully about a community, and each of you live in different communities, on a certain level, a community are like-minded people getting together to accomplish their goals. And that's fine. But there are multiple communities. And a bayit is something that integrates. Yaakov Avinu integrated everything. There were 12 shvatim, and he integrated all of that together. That's a bayit. If you paid attention to this week's Haftorah, it basically described what's supposed to happen. It opens with Eitz Echad LiYehuda, and another one, Eitz Echad LiYosef. And then further on in the Haftorah, it says, Ko amar Hashem Elokim, Hinei ani lokeach et bnei Yisrael mibein hagoyim, ve'asiti otam legoy echad ba'aretz. And it says Natati otam alav et Eitz Yehuda va'asitim le'etz echad ve'ayu echad biyadi. There's going to be a unity, and that's the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is that Yehuda and Yosef, with their differences in Avodat Hashem, come together, unite, and this is how Klal Yisrael is really supposed to function. And I'd like to think and convinced that people sitting in this audience buy into that, realize it, live their lives that way. And the testimony to the success that we've had over 45 years is sitting out here in the audience. We're going to hear from Rabbi Schoonmaker and Rabbi Manning, both of whom are relatively new additions to the Hanhala of the yeshiva. And yet one of the things that we're proud of is that if you take a brochure that we published 30 years ago for recruiting or fundraising, and you look at it today, it looks like it was written yesterday. One of the consistencies of our approach. And I think that that says a lot about the authenticity which I think is one of the themes today, the authenticity of our approach, that when we say, Ma Hashem, Ma Tov U'ma Hashem Doresh Mimcha, what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want from us? And it's not necessarily, I don't even want to start going into all the politics and all the divisiveness, because what it is Asot Mishpat, Avat Tzedek, Hatznei Alechet Im Elokecha, honest, Torah values, good midos. This is the common denominator that exists with every person sitting in this room. It's what we educate you to. And we're looking forward to hearing new approaches which are going to resonate exactly the same approaches that we've been talking about for so many years. When we talk about Yaakov, we have to remember our introduction to him is the dream. What is his dream? Sulam mutzav arza v'rosho magia hashamayma. That's the Jew. You have to have your feet on the ground, real life, and yet you have to have aspirations for the heaven. And we also quote another pasuk in Mishlei, Atz beraglov, somebody who rushes their legs. You're in a hurry to get somewhere, chote, you missed the mark. And I think one of the things that you all heard from us, growth is slow. You have to be constantly looking to grow and having confidence in yourselves and patience with yourselves, that it takes time. This is what Yaakov Avinu taught us, the integration of Chesed of Avraham and Din of Yitzchak, the integration which makes a bayit, and therefore this is much more than a community. Each of you has your own communities, but we come together and bring those communities together to try to accomplish the ultimate goals of Klal Yisrael, and it can't happen with one approach or one community or one hashkafa, because Drachei Darchei Noam, as Rav Hirsch points out, and this is the founding of the yeshiva, there are multiple paths in Torah. They have to be integrated. They have to be Noam. And we're proud. The nachas we get is seeing all of you here, knowing that you have succeeded in integrating and living the values we try to teach to you. And now we're going to hand it over to Rabbi Schoonmaker and then Rabbi Manning to share some of their thoughts on the topic.
It's such a schus to speak in front of you on a topic, really much more than a topic, which is so precious to us all. When I first came to the yeshiva 9 Elul ago, I gave the third shmuz that Zman. Rabbi Karlinski, I believe, gave the first one. Rav Schuster gave the second. When I started my shmuz, after hearing their 2 shmuz in the previous weeks, I said, who says Shapell doesn't have a hashkafa? So it's so good we get together, mechazik each other, mechazik our Darchei Noam. I want to begin by sharing 2 models of Darchei Noam in action. 2 models of how to live with a Darchei Noam mindset. What does this look like? As you already know, of course, when the rubber hits the road. For the first, I share one of the strongest, most amazing sources that I know in this whole topic. It's from a not as well known as he deserved to be Gaon from Bnei Brak, named Soroya Dublitsky. It was spoken about as someone who had mastery of the whole Torah, the written Torah, the revealed Torah, the hidden Torah. And in the middle of a halachic discussion in the Sefer called Per Yaakov, he shares these words with my loose translation. For hundreds of years, so perhaps since the time of Chorban Bayis, Klal Yisrael has been split into groups that are all different, beloved, and holy. What they all share is they all want to reach spiritual completeness and closeness to the Creator. Here's the most notable part. He or she, I add, who desires to be the complete Eved Hashem, servant of God, must accept upon himself as much as possible to adopt the good and effective things that are in each group. I'm going to read that line again. He or she who desires to be the complete Eved Hashem, servant of God, must accept upon himself as much as possible to adopt the good and effective things that are in each group. Incredible. And he continues, and one who accepts such won't have any questions on anyone else. And this will remove all negative feelings and repulsion hidden in his heart. And he finishes with his punch. In our times, it is near impossible for one who truly desires to grow and develop in Avodas Hashem unless they go in this way. And if one takes this advice, they can truly be hopeful that when they hit 100, they won't look like a 20-year-old in their spiritual level in all details. This is incredible. On the sign about this Melave Malkah, as was referred to, we use words like integrity and authentic. But here we see this is more than that. The Rachad Darchinom is an imperative, a must, an urgent idea for he or she that desires to be a true Eved Hashem. Because no group is complete today. And it's been hundreds and hundreds of years like that. And different groups are expressing different aspects of Avodas Hashem. And if you don't learn and follow them, you will be lacking. How will one gain the X of this group or the Y of that group unless they look for the ma'alot, for the levels of each group? And if you don't do such, where will we learn it from? There's an old expression, which you know, which gets this idea across. Learn with the Litvaks, dine with the Hasidim, eat with the Yekis. I want to share a second model. At the end of the day, Dublitsky is making quite a high bar. He lived by that bar. Not everyone has the bandwidth to be that wide and to intensely learn, imbibe, and gain and grow from everyone. Many of us are struggling to make ends meet, catch a daf yomi on the way back from work, not yell at our husband when he once again forgot to put his socks in the drawer. Make sure our young children are eating something more than sugar and processed foods once in a while. So in the context of all that, you want me to go and daven with the Hasidim as opposed to my local minyan? And I should emphasize, to understand any derech well, you need to be deeply involved in it. Imagine someone who had a year to learn. He came to Shapell's for 3 months, and then Aish for 3 months, and then Machon Shlomo for 3 months, and Or Sameach for 3 months. He will be, as we say in Yiddish, nish dehin, nish deher. Not here, not there, nowhere. So living with the Reb Dublitsky way is easier said than done, but it's certainly an awesome way to live and aspire to for the true Eved Hashem. So let's share another model. There's a beautiful medrash that describes how Klal Yisrael went through the Yam at the splitting of the sea. It is well known that the sea was split into 12 different paths, one for each Shevet. Less well known is that some midrashim say that the walls between one Shevet to the other were transparent. There was some type of window there. What was that all about, the transparency? And why was the sea split in 12 different ways? We know that Hashem doesn't make a nace, doesn't make miracles unnecessarily. Here's my understanding. There are 12 different paths through the sea because it's important that each Shevet of Klal Yisrael experience Kriyas Yam Suf in its own way. There's a Yisachar way to experience it, and there's a totally different Naphtali way, and even a Zvulun and a Gad way. And Hashem wanted each Shevet's path. That's the 12 paths. But why transparent? Because while you're in your own way, as you should be, you should still be learning and checking out what other Shvatim are doing. They have truths also. I can learn from them. What's up over there? I am a happy Levi passing through the sea singing Levi songs. But what is Yehuda doing? Whoa, look at Shevet Ruvain in all its glory. I'm going like Levi, but I learn from Ruvain. So one is deeply rooted in a specific path. Not as much maybe in the many paths that Dublitsky is talking about. That's certainly a model, but still very open to the influence and beauty of different Shvatim. And this model, which I've heard leading Rabbanim like Rav Lopiansky or Reuven Leichter, my Rebbe, promote, is you have to be on your mahalach with a certain level of exclusivity. But of course, you're taking the beautiful views and growing from the other Shvatim. These are two different mahalchim of Derech Darchinom. I want to add a general point from the holy words of Alumni Melave Malkah, well-known words. Adarabba, tein b'libenu, shira kol echad malat chavereinu v'lo chesrono. Put in our hearts, see the beautiful things of our friends and not their chesronot. This is true for individuals, and this is true for communities. Now, of course, we're going to see chesronot, we're going to see faultings in others, and we do need a level of critique to decide where we want to be. How do you decide between one derech and another? But we have to remember those words as individuals, and we have to remember those words as communities. And to live those words and to be authentic to Darchei Noam, I think it is critical that we also see our personal and our communal, of our specific communities, chesronot, lackings. If I see my community as the be-all and end-all, we are the best in all areas, complete, untainted, and perfect. The word from is You in the middle, fanatically religious on one side and modern on the other side. Then neither the model that I've delineated or I think that anyone can delineate for Darchei Noam can be truly authentic and respectful. I'll give a few examples. On Shabbos, I daven in a lively, even rambunctious, yeshiva-oriented Karlebach minyan. I daven there because I love the singing, the quality of the Bali Tefillah, who are off the charts, and the fact that guys really want to be there. But if you ask me, from this minyan, or the poskim, or the halakhic side, is the next generation going to come? I wouldn't bet on it, generally. The next Rav Eliashiv or Rav Vaji Yosef might be davening the minyan that is more boring, less singing, and probably starts a lot earlier. That was a joke. Okay. So my minyan should not look down on the guys in the other minyan, because those guys in the other minyan are producing something else. But the way of people is to be attached and unaware of their own lackings and aware of the lackings. And that throws off the integrity of Darchei Noam. Another example, my sons go to Hebron Yeshiva, close by, the classical Lithuanian Yeshiva. If one of them said to me they wanted to go learn in Toldos Aaron, deep in Mei Sharim, in more ways than one, I would faint. I'm not sure what I would do after that, but my initial response would be to faint. Yet, I would rather go, as hundreds of others, to the Simchas Beis HaShoeva in Toldos Aaron than the Simchas Beis HaShoeva in Hebron. There's a certain simplicity and purity in their extreme lifestyle. And it's only there because of their extreme lifestyle. And anyone who walks in feels it, and it's attractive, and it has a spiritual charisma. Rav Dessler has a seminal letter where he speaks about the difference back in Europe of the Hersheyan Germany system and the Lithuanian yeshiva system. He says that the German Jews did a much better job en masse of keeping the tzibur religious. But there were almost no Gedolei Torah that were produced from Germany. And those that did come out usually went to Lithuanian yeshivas. While the Lithuanian yeshivas produced many, many Gedolei Torah. Think of all those who recreated so much of Yiddishkeit in yeshivas and Hasidus, not Hasidus, but so much of Yiddishkeit in America and Europe and Eretz Yisrael, but didn't help the masses nearly as much as the Germans did. If so, doesn't it make sense that each world deeply respected the other? These are three examples, but I think we get the point. Some final points. To successfully accomplish this, one needs not only to be open to one's own faults, but to have the ability to judge things correctly. Whoever said, learn with the Litvaks, daven with the Hasidim, and eat with the Yekis, had to know something about learning davening and kashrus. Otherwise, maybe it's all the opposite. Maybe I should eat with the Litvaks, daven with the Yekis, and learn with the Hasidim. So you have to know. And it isn't always easy to know. And sometimes you need to ask in order to understand the different worlds, their malot, chesronot, goals, and accomplishments. One final point. Underneath it all is something I think is the foundation of Darchei Noam. We have to keep remembering that Klal Yisrael is a family. Sometimes dysfunctional, but families are family. And keep developing our Av Yisrael. I often like to say about the yeshiva, Shapell's, where we don't just talk about Av Yisrael, rather where we live it. So I'm inviting all of us, we keep remembering who our family is and keep living Av Yisrael. Thank you very much.
Shavua Tov, good vach, everybody. What a schus to be here, able to speak to such a wonderful group, especially having my mum and dad here as well. It's always very special. So thank you for that opportunity. It's so obvious that Darchei Noam is the way that Judaism works. The question is, why isn't everybody part of this yeshiva? And I want to address that question a little bit, maybe, just give a few ideas. Because baked into the system of Yiddishkeit is this dichotomy, this paradox. Darchei one, its thing, it Torah, the Chochmah, its ways. It is a one unit, but there are multiple ways. Darchei Noam. The Torah is an Eitz Chaim. This is the same psukim. Eitz Chaim hi. It's one unit, but it's split into so many things. And this is a paradox that we feel. How can we live in a world where it's the Olam HaYichud, it's the world of God, Hashem Echad, and yet the world we live in is so fragmented and pixelated, and things seem to be so separated. So really, this question goes to the root of everything I think that we're trying to understand. The Torah is given by one God. Kulam nitnu miraya echad. says the Psukim in Kohelet, and the Gemara in Chagiga says, Keil echad nitnam, natnam, one God gave them, parnas echad amram, one, it came in one unit from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it came through Moshe Rabbeinu, and yet, Vayedaber Elokim et kol hadvarim ha'ele. God said a multitude of things. And we have some very important sources. There's a Ritva in Eruvin, when he's talking about Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim, which we'll get back to in a second. And he says when Moshe was standing on Sinai and asking God to give him the Torah, for every single question Moshe asked, the Ritva quotes a Midrash in Tehillim, that God gave him 49 ways of understanding how it could be permitted, and 49 ways of understanding how it could be prohibited. And Moshe turns around and says, well, I need some clarity here. I need a psak. He said, oh, you need clarity? Go to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin will give you one psak. That's where you're going to get your one psak, your one approach throughout. And it goes even deeper. The Maharshal, Rav Shlomo Luria, says actually every single Jew who studied Har Sinai received Torah through their own channel, through their own sinor. He says that is what it means that they saw the sounds. They didn't see sounds. It means that they took the information download and everyone was receiving on their own channel, to the point that one Jew could stand at Sinai and say, that was incredible. God said X. And a Jew standing next to him said, it was incredible, but God didn't say X, God said Y. And another Jew could say something completely different. That's the nature of how Torah works. And that's how it always was. And in terms of clarity, we always went to the Sanhedrin for one psak. Look, we make a bracha when we see 600,000 Jews in one place. I once tried to make this bracha at Rav Ovadia Yosef's Levaya. I thought, this is my big moment. I only saw two people the whole evening. The guy that was in front of me like this, and the guy that was in front of me like that. And we walked down together, and we walked back together. I didn't make a bracha at all. But if you have it handy, you make a bracha at 600,000 Jews. What's the bracha? Chacham HaRazim. The God knows all of the individual minds of these people, because just like every single one of them has a different face, every single one of them has a different approach to Torah. And when you come into my class, I don't expect you to take my face. You can keep your own face. You'll be very grateful for that. And I don't expect you to take my view either. So how do we make this real? How do we put this into a real life and workable system? So I want to make a suggestion to you. Maybe it's a bit of a chiddush. Maybe it's something a little bit new. But it worked in the way that I mentioned just now, that the Sanhedrin gave this clear psak. We went to the Bet Din HaGadol, both in halacha and also in hashkafa, and that's very clear from the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. But at a certain point, that stopped working. The Gemara says at the end of, the Mishnah says at the end of Soitza, the Gemara in Tzmura, that when Yossi ben Yoeza and Yossi ben Yochanan died, the Torah was no longer transmitted in the way that it had been previously. They no longer had that clarity. Rashi says, what had crept into it? Machlokas, doifi, two approaches, two views. So what's going to be? How can we have that? Because we need that kind of uniformity to keep all these different perspectives together. So that's why I want to suggest in the next generation, Rabbi Yeshua ben Parachia says, Aseh lecha Rav. He has to say that now. Aseh lecha Rav. Why did they never say Aseh lecha Rav before? Because you don't need a Rav. You have the Sanhedrin. Everyone has the same Rav. You have all of these approaches, but the Sanhedrin brings them all together. So at that point, we now had a reality which is Aseh lecha Rav. So really what we're doing today, when we're trying to find our path through multiple paths, is just make sure that we're Aseh lecha Rav. We're plugged in halacha, in hashkafa, into a valid Masorah. Okay, you need to work out what is valid, what isn't valid, but really that's what we're trying to do. And that's how we bring up our kids. We bring them up at a certain derech, and they get to an age where they realize that there are multiple drachim, and then they move on. There are kids that grow up Hasidish and become Yekas and Litvaks, and there are people that grow up modern Orthodox, become Haredi, and the other way around. Because at a certain point, we say to our kids, okay, you know, we brought you up this way, we've given you this derech, but Aseh lecha Rav, that's how it works. You have to go out and find your own Rav. And really what we're doing, I think, in Darchei Noam, is simply teaching our students that this is the way the world works. There is a unity, and there is a plurality, but there's no longer a Sanhedrin. So the only way you can really navigate that reality is Aseh lecha Rav. So why doesn't everybody agree? Why do people say, well, I don't know, you can't teach people multiple things, it's going to be confusing, etc.? I have a few different answers. I'm not going to give them all now, okay? But the main answer, I think, is as follows. You don't turn around to a 7-year-old child, to your kid, and say, listen, the world's very complicated. I say l'charav. You've got to start thinking about which is the derech that really, is your shorish neshama. No, that's a terrible disaster. You bring up a kid with a clear hashkafa and a clear approach to life, and when they get older and they become more discerning and they understand the world in a more complex way, then you say, okay, now you can go and be yourself. You don't have to. It's hard as a parent. It's difficult when a kid, you brought up a certain way, and they go off I'm not saying off the derech, in a different derech. It's difficult to let go, but that's how it works. But you don't say it to a 7-year-old. So I want to suggest to you that really what's going on here, and what I think we're trying to do, is as follows. When someone comes through our door who is a 27-year-old, but they have the Jewish background of a 3rd, 4th grader, and they're trying to catch up, how do you relate to them? On the one hand, you could say, well, look, this person has the Jewish knowledge and background of a 7-year-old. And therefore, we're not going to say asay l'charav. You can't go and do that. I'm going to make I'm going to be your Rav. You're my child. And just like you grew up in my home and I'm your parent and you do what I say, so I'm your Rav. As opposed to someone who says, okay, something, this person has a limited Jewish background, but they have the brain of a 27-year-old. They have the complexity of a 27-year-old. They don't have the brain of a 7-year-old. And therefore, everything they do in life, they expect to have that level of complexity. And if you don't give it to them, then they'll sniff it out and they'll say there's something missing. So I think really what's going on here in terms of Darchei Noam is how you transmit this idea of Aseh L'Charav, whether you give your students the space, if you like, and treat them with the sophistication and nuance that they have as an adult thinker, or whether you say, look, I'm concerned it's going to be confusing because you don't yet have the Jewish background to do that. And I think that's often a difficult balance, and it's something that we often work out and try and work through ourselves. But I think really that's what's going on in terms of the Makoros. I think the key here is Aseh L'Charav, and working out, of course, who is a real Rav and who is not a real Rav is a whole question. Maybe that's something we can deal with more. But I'd like to suggest that as something of a philosophy of Darchei Noam, and see that goes forward.
When I learned at Shapell's Darchei Noam, it seemed that hashkafically I could develop in any direction within the bounds of Orthodox Judaism. Okay. Does the yeshiva strive for a certain direction for the students, or are there basic core hashkafic principles which the yeshiva feels that the students absolutely must acquire during their years in the beis medrash? So I'm going to repeat that dialectic again. Does the yeshiva strive for a certain direction for students, or are there basic core hashkafic principles which the yeshiva feels that the student absolutely must acquire during their years in the beis medrash? So some of you who have been in my hashkafa classes know the answer to that is yes. There is definitely a direction that we strive for, and that is that they absolutely must acquire years in the beis medrash, which is exactly what Rabbi Schoonmaker and Rabbi Manning were talking about. I think what I mentioned in the opening is an absolute commitment to halacha, good midos, integrity and honesty. And the truth is, and I've said this many times, is that all of the Orthodox Torah systems share that 70% we're sharing. And somehow or other, we're always focusing on the 30%, the 30% that separates us. So in the yeshiva, we strive, in the midrasha, we strive that the direction for the students are basic core hashkafic principles. Halacha, a meticulous observance of halacha, good midos and honesty, integrity, limud Torah as the foundation of our lives. And that's what everybody has to have. This question reminds me of years ago when I was doing recruiting trips. So there are a lot of people who have they don't buy into Darchei Noam. They buy into, there's a box. And therefore they ask me frequently, because they want to know whether they want to send us or not, so what's the ideal picture of your student when he leaves or when she leaves? What's your ideal picture? And my answer always was, how could I know that if they haven't even come in yet? We really believe that every individual has to go in the direction that's appropriate, but there are definitely core values.
Okay. How do we continue with the Darchei Noam approach when we strongly disagree with other Jews' path? Yeah, questions clear? Yeah? Okay. Should I stand or is this okay? First off, I think, before we continue, I just think we should communally, Rabbi Manning was talking about making a bracha of Chacham HaRazim, but I think we should make a bracha of Asali Nes B'Makom Hazeh. God has made a miracle in this place because 3 rabbis spoke and none of us went over the time that was allotted to us on the paper. So, we didn't even get the 2-minute warning, so distance it a little. Okay, sure. Thank you. Okay, good. So how do we continue with the approach when we really strongly disagree, right? If communities are at odds with each other, individuals are at odds with each other, etc. That's a very good question. I think the idea is a lot of what was said already, building on the ideas we said already. And I want to share an idea that I talk about being in a community, a different idea, but I want to borrow the formulation, the construct. What does it mean to be part of a community in general? Forget Darchino for a second. You're whatever community, and you're part of Midrash Rachel, you're part of community in RBS, perhaps, the yeshiva, any yeshiva. So he's like, yeah, I'm totally into the tzibur. I love that. I'm part of that. Well, if the only time you're part of it is when it's easy, you're not really part of it. You're self-serving, meaning I like Mishmar in yeshiva, so I go to Mishmar. But I don't like in Shabbos. I hate third meal in yeshiva, Shalashudas in yeshiva, so I leave for Shalashudas. So I'm part of the community 80% of the time. No, you're not, because you're only doing what's good for you. And when it doesn't match you exactly, so then you leave it. Makes sense? So that's part of being part of anything. When you're looking for the person in the shul you can count on, it's the person who's cleaning up after the kiddush when everybody left already, when it's difficult. That's the definition of what it means to be part of a community. So similarly, just moving the idea over, we're not talking about community, but the idea of if you buy into Darchei Noam, that means you buy into when it's difficult. That's I would say that's a kind of definitional. It's very easy to be Darchei Noam when everybody is at the kotel and you're in a circle with Hasidim and Kippot Zrugot and everybody's happy, etc. Wow, of course, Darchei Noam. Why not? And then you're at a simcha where everybody's happy. But what happens when we don't look at each other? That's when the rubber hits the road, and that's where we have to start living by our values. So I think the answer is to go back to the values. Like anytime, every challenge we have in life, it's a challenge to be tachon. What do? You go back to the values. That's story, that's shmooze, that's sicha, the divrei Torah that were shared tonight so beautifully. You go back to those things, all the things you do, but you have to keep being mitchazek, because that's where the challenge is, and there will be challenges, of course. That's the point, especially as many don't get it. So then I have to go back to that and say, I strongly disagree with this community. I have that. Okay, I want to share a shocking line, which I was hoping to find a place to share it, and but I do. I was zocha to be in. I was not a student of Eshet Torah. I wasn't a student of Rabbi Weinberg, but I was around Reb Noach, and I loved him deeply, and I respect him. I see him as a great man, an Onam Gadol. Really, I think it was a historic figure. I have no doubt that many of the people here are a step or two or three because of Rabbi Weinberg. So I think we all have to have a karstov. But anyway, we had a Shabbaton. I think it was up in Nov, and we put a lot of money into the Shabbaton. We had a sponsor, maybe $50K, something like that. And there was a bunch of, in Aish, we were really trying to get, Reb Noach's agenda, as he told me when I first took the job, was that we want to create people who will go into Kiruv. That was the stated goal, was clear, it was very clear. And we had a group of like new Avrechim, a new Kolel with young guys, yeshiva guys, like top-level yeshiva guys, a whole strategy that we're going to get these guys to go into Kiruv eventually. That was the setting. And someone asked Reb Noach, like, what do you think about Jews that don't go into Kiruv? And I was ready for him to, who knows what, And he said, I agree with him in 98% of the things. I was shocked. That's what you say, Yeah, we agree on 98% of the things, as I think Rabbi Kolinsky mentioned, or Rabbi Manning mentioned, that we're so good at seeing where we, our dear Rabbi Lerner's in the office, I don't have the thing, but you have a dot. When you pick up the paper, and everybody sees the dot. So you don't see all the white. So we're always picking up on chesronos. We're always picking up on those things. So we have to keep remembering that we agree with 98%, and especially today when the enemies inside and outside are so strong. Radical Islam is gaining all over the world. And the name Muhammad is the third biggest name. In Israel, we know what's going on, but we see what's going on around the world. It's nothing, no chidushim here. Now is the time for us to weaken our Ahavas Yisrael. Now is the time for us to weaken our sense of love, our sense of dedication. We disagree strongly, yell at each other for sure. But family's family. I want to finish. I'm going. You could do the warning now, but there were two brothers, Rotman brothers. Anybody from Baltimore? Any Baltimoreans? So I don't know in your time, but there was a very chashuv Talmid Chacham in Baltimore named Rotman, and he was a big bucky. And Gittin, I think maybe he's a Talmud or Moshe Feinstein. He's one of the biggest people on the north side in Gittin. I'm going to finish with this point. But I remember he had two sons in yeshiva. They were both brilliant. I was in Karen Biavna, as Rabbi Chaim Lindsay was for 2 years, and I think it was my first Zman or two in Reb Tzvi. And these brothers, when they would talk and learning with each other, you thought the house was going to get, we thought they were going to kill each other. I mean, they were yelling at each other, screaming at each other, yelling in a way which doesn't happen in our base matters, and it doesn't happen, not that popular at all today. I remember there was this little Avreich, an English guy. I thought they were going to kill each other. He said one time, I didn't know what was going to be. And then they would walk out like hand in hand. You fight to the death. It's important for sure. Okay, now we're all family. And Orthodox people are really family. We're all family. So that's why we have to keep up to it. Okay.
By the way, I learned in Atzeres Yisrael in Baivagan in a Chevron yeshiva, and I was the English guy sitting next to the screaming Israeli. Like at one point, I actually turned around to him and said, "You have to," and my head hurts. And he screamed in my face, "He says, Mitzvah d'Oraisa!" Like, okay, fine. So I was,
So, full disclosure, Rabbi Feigelbaum and I were chavrusas in Keren B'Yavin, and then we continued being chavrusas in Mir. And you can ask anybody who was in Mir in those years, 70, 71, 72. The two of us probably screamed at each other louder than anybody else in the base medrash. Okay, but we ended up starting the yeshiva together. But as chavrusas, we were at each other, we were screaming.
I'm going to use this mic just to be... I have another question here. How do we define what is an acceptable alternative derech and what is not? What are the limits of deracheha darachei noam? That's a whole shir. But I would maybe just say the following. When we talked before about asay lecha rav, get yourself a rav, that doesn't mean someone living down the road who calls himself rabbi. There's lots of people who call themselves rabbis. Some of them are great. Some of them are not great. Some of them, have their own particular peculiarities. They're not necessarily part of a Masorah. On this, I would definitely recommend, there is a wonderful essay by Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, and he has an essay on the legitimation of modernity. Something called something like that. And there he goes through this question in great detail, and he says, how do we define what is and isn't a valid derech? And he says, a valid derech in hashkafa, he's talking about hashkafa, is one which is underpinned by a godel in hashkafa, someone who that community relates to as a godel. And if we're all being honest, we know who the Gedolim are. Yes, there are some unusual cases where one great person held the other one was completely osa. The Rav Shach had some very strong things to say about Chabad, and Rav Elchanan Wasserman had some very strong things to say about religious Zionism. But most people don't hold those sort of this is prohibited kind of views. And everybody agrees who are the Gedolim. And therefore, they may not be the Gedolim of your community, but Rav Lichtenstein therefore says that religious Zionism is a legitimate hashkafic position because it's legitimated by the existence of Rav Kook and the world that he created. And centrist orthodoxy, whatever you want to call it, is legitimated by Rav Soloveitchik. And you can say, yes, but it's not exactly what they said it was. Of course, everything develops. But you can't found a hashkafa on, well, my rabbi down the road, he thinks that it's okay too. ... Well, who is he? Is he somebody who actually could be called a great person? And again, we all really agree on the great people. And if we don't, often it's insecurity. We're not playing those kind of, my Gedolim are bigger than your Gedolim kind of game. Your Gedolim are Katanim, really. Like only people who just have no confidence in their own hashkafa get into that. We all agree who the big people are. And if they say this is a legitimate derech in the Darachei Noam, then it is. You don't have to do it, but it's a legitimate one. So I think that actually will weed out a lot of the things that we feel are uncomfortably on the fringes because they're genuinely not underpinned and supported by the people who even they will say are the Gedolim. They'll say, I like this rabbi, but okay, fine. But they're not enough of a figure to create a derech in Derachei HaDarchei Noam. I really recommend that article. You can pull it off the internet and read it. Happy to take questions on it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something that, it was very interesting. When I went to Psiko Shalevsky, which, as I mentioned, I went from Karbi Avnet, which was a black yeshiva. I didn't go there to be yeshivish. I went there because I wanted to learn, and it was a good place to learn. I was actually thinking about going to Gush 3 times, but I ended up there, and it was right when the machlokas between Rav Shach and was breaking, which was terrible for me. And the fact that I had a Rebbe who was very into Lubavitcher Rebbe made it harder for me. But anyway, we're not talking about my personal stories or making my brachas. But what I want to point out is you see later that so much of the world has embraced Lubavitcher Rebbe and has embraced Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik has learned to really all. I'm just resonating what Rav Banning said, that everybody knows who the real people are, and they're machlokesim, and they're very strong things. But you see today how much Lubavitch is accepted on a wider level around, and I hope it goes the other way, and how much of Soloveitchik's farm are read all over. So it's we see that.
Okay, so I guess this was the question that we all dreaded. How are we going to deal with it? And I'm going to try to walk between the raindrops. I'll read the question as it's written. And I'm going to probably build on what Rabbi Manning and Rabbi Schoonmaker just said with a couple of additions. I'm going to read the question as it's written, even though I would have phrased it a little differently. Is this a legitimate Torah approach? No one from our community can serve in the army, not young men that are not in yeshiva learning, not young men that want to serve in Haredi unit, not young men that want to serve in a non-combat capacity of national service. So is it a legitimate Torah approach? This is a big question, and it has many dimensions: halachic, hashkafic, political, and practical. Is it a legitimate Torah approach? If you hear it firsthand in the name of some, as Rabbi Schoonmaker and Rabbi Manning mentioned, legitimate Torah Gadolim, then it becomes a legitimate Torah approach. Is it any of ours? Probably not. But this is such a complicated question. I really like to quote Thomas Sowell, and it's very applicable here. Thomas Sowell, when he talks about politics or many communal issues and governmental decisions, there is no solutions to problems. There are only trade-offs. And everything is a trade-off. And if you listen carefully to the people on all sides and exactly what they're saying, you realize that each approach has validity, but you obviously can't live all the approaches. And each of us has to decide what resonates with us and what our Rabbanim promote. And a note from my son, who's very, very involved in this. He said there's a very big difference between a decision that has to be made in a public proclamation and the advice being given to individuals. And this is the Aseh L'Charav. And even the most extreme positions, those people, when you go to them privately and you describe exactly the situation, they will give you a very personalized psak. That's Aseh L'Charav. That's Gedolim. I have firsthand experience with this. Again, I'm not talking about the extremists and the fringes, but you have to have Aseh L'Charav. And is it a legitimate Torah approach? You know, it's not for me to say. It's certainly not our approach. There is validity to it as public policy to try to make a point. But in practical terms, I don't think it works. And again, every person has to know that there are values that require full-time learning. There are values that require service in the army. There are values that require service to community. How do we navigate that? It has to be with the core values of Torah, and that has to be the primary value, the primary perspective. And they are all manifestations of Torah. Everything is community, everything is chesed, everything is limud Torah. That has to be, that's the whole Klal Yisrael. And not everybody does everything, but everybody has to do something. And it's a very delicate question. I really think that it's more of a private discussion. Aseh L'Charav, look for the legitimacy of all the approaches and realize that we need everything. We need all of the approaches to make the whole fabric of Klal Yisrael. And Bezrat Hashem, if we would have less machloikas and more respect for the alternatives, I think HaKadosh Baruch Hu would be a lot happier with us also.
Can I just add something which is not on the substantive point, but I think just on the general issue, the range of legitimate approaches that we can legitimate based on the system may be broader than the range of approaches we feel we wish to teach in the institution. We may turn around to our students and say, yes, this has a legitimacy as a Torah approach, but we don't think it's something that we want to teach. So I think that those two things are potentially different. And I think that's feeds into that question as well. Just because we might consider it legitimate doesn't mean it's something we would recommend.
I want to share something not on that question itself, but something along the line in the middle that Rabbi Karlinsky mentioned, which was that there's which everybody probably knows, but I want to share a few stories that I know close up, very close up, that, meaning I heard it from reliable people who are one or two steps away from the story, that there's like the public stance, which I'm not talking about that particular statement, or those statements at all, but just any public stance. A public stance was made, and then when someone goes to a gadol and if he has the time and opportunity to really mind them and speak to them. So I think two stories that happens to be about Rav Shach, but the stories are true about many gedolim that are strong liners, as Rav Shach definitely was. So if someone came to Rav Shach about an eitzah, I heard this from my Rebbe Rav Yaakov Friedman. I think it happened to a friend of his, and Rav Shach told him this. He said, the pachkivilim on the how do you translate that word? On the what's a pachkiv? The posters. On the posters, doesn't say that's your opinion. He said that poster is for the people who get das Torah from the posters. I mean, that's who it's for. I'm giving you an eitzah for you. I know Rabbi Kamlinsky has a story about this. Maybe you can share afterwards. And I'm going to tell you exactly how it happened. There's someone named Chayes Sprung, who was when I was by Reb Tzvi, he was a Sholem Yeshiv. And he told me this story. He was I won't say the yeshiva's name, but there was someone who came to learn in yeshiva who was a medical student and had 1 year left in medical school. And he came to yeshiva to learn for a year, regular yeshiva, and the Rosh Yeshiva saw his potential, and everybody was pushing him to give up medical school and go full forward as a Torah scholar, etc. So this is how Rabbi Sprung, was a very colorful figure, said to me. He says, "No, I knew the fellow, and I was going to get killed by the parents." So I had to go to someone really open-minded to save me. So I went to Laser Shach, and Rav Shach, of course, told him to finish medical school, and he gave him a whole list of things to do. Raise your children to be Talmidei Chacham, I think he said. And he said, learn with someone who will teach you the depth of Torah, but become a doctor. But when you would hear that story, no, Rav Shach would never say such a thing. And I've heard that from Beryl Gershfeld, told me the same thing. He said to me, Rav Shach has given me eitzes that you would think a Dati Lumi rabbi would give. So it's very important, just in general, the public debate. Sometimes people have to. I'm not defending it. I'm just explaining what happens. By the way, even the Gemara, sometimes you find even there are Gemaras which I just had a Gemara in Pesachim where Shmuel said something in the name of the Rabbeim because he wanted to be accepted, even though it wasn't. So there's a public way when people run a community that they feel they have to. We should all make a bracha every morning besides besides Shasaniz L'Makam Hazeh. We should make a bracha Shlo Asani Gadol. Because it's a tough life, because you have to have the public stance and the private stance. But that explains a lot of things. And also you have to know how to take those things. That's for the people reading the Pachkivilim, but that's not a Selech Harab. That's and by having Rabbanim and being closer to what's really happening, you can get a far more nuanced, correct approach to things.
I'll just conclude by saying that I have numerous stories of having gone when we needed a tzah for specific Talmidim in certain situations. And the stories really validate this, that we got very local advice that turned out, one of the cases we went to Shlomo Zalman, I'm not going to go into the details, but he gave a certain advice that I don't think most Haredi yeshivish Rabbanim would have given. He gave us a certain advice. And years later, he gave me a reason. The reason was in Hebrew. The couple didn't understand Hebrew, so he had to give me what was his reasoning. And I met the couple years later, and I mentioned to them that what happened. He says, "You know what? If we wouldn't have followed the advice, I wouldn't be from today. But it was advice that only Reb Shlomo Zalman could give. That's why we'll end with this point. Have reliable poskim rabbonim that you know that know you and are authoritative, and that's how you got to run your life. Shavua tov.